The sun was just beginning to climb the sky, casting a golden hue over the peaceful suburban neighborhood. Birds chirped merrily in the trees, their songs a gentle soundtrack to the morning. The streets were quiet, lined with well-kept homes, each lawn neatly manicured. Flower beds bloomed with vibrant colors, and a soft breeze rustled the leaves in the trees, carrying the sweet scent of spring. It was the kind of morning that felt timeless, as though nothing could disturb the serenity of the world. In the front yard of one of these homes, Sarah Collins stood by the open front door, sipping her coffee. Her calm demeanor was the epitome of the suburban mom, organized, patient, and at ease with her routine. Sarah's gaze drifted across the front yard, her eyes following her young son, Max, as he played with his toy truck in the driveway. His laughter echoed through the still air, bright and innocent. His small hands pushed the truck back and forth, the sound of its wheels on the pavement, the only interruption to the quiet stillness. Sarah couldn't help but smile as she watched him, her heart swelling with the pride and love of motherhood. The morning was perfect. Everything in Sarah's life was in its place. Her husband, David, was on a business trip, but they had spoken earlier that morning, and he promised he'd be back soon. The house was peaceful, and the world outside seemed calm. It was the kind of normalcy Sarah cherished, simple, uneventful. She was grateful for these moments, for the balance they brought. Max, oblivious to the world around him, ran over to a patch of flowers along the edge of the driveway, crouching down to examine the petals closely. Sarah's smile deepened, her heart full of warmth. She was content in this fleeting moment, and for a second, everything felt right in the world. She sipped her coffee again, savoring the warmth that spread through her. This was the life she had worked so hard to build, a life she loved, a life she protected fiercely. But as she gazed at Max, a shift in the atmosphere caught her attention. The air, so peaceful just moments before, seemed to grow heavier. It was subtle at first, the sensation of something nearing, something out of place. Sarah didn't notice at first, but the warmth from her coffee began to feel distant as a shadow crept over her. She felt it before she saw it, a presence approaching. A figure emerged at the end of the driveway, making her heart skip a beat. It was Lynn Ford, the HOA Karen. Sarah's eyes narrowed instinctively as she saw the woman walking towards her. She had seen Lynn countless times before, always impeccably dressed in her tidy outfits, with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Lynn was known throughout the neighborhood as the unofficial enforcer of the HOA rules, the one who had a knack for finding something to criticize, something to complain about. Her reputation preceded her, and Sarah had learned to avoid her when possible. There was always an undercurrent of tension when Lynn was around, a sharpness in her gaze, a constant need to assert control over others. Lynn approached with her usual confidence, her heels clicking on the pavement. Sarah's heart clenched, the tranquility of the morning slowly slipping away. She put her coffee down and stood up straighter, bracing herself. She couldn't remember the last time Lynn had just walked past without a word. No, Lynn always had something to say, and it was never good. "Good morning, Sarah," Lynn said in a tone that was too cheery to be genuine. Her smile was wide, but her eyes were cold, scanning the scene in front of her with a sense of ownership. "How's Max today?" Sarah smiled back politely, but the warmth had faded from her face. "He's good, just playing around." Lynn's eyes flicked to Max, who was now sitting on the grass, his truck beside him. There was a slight pause as Lynn's gaze lingered a bit too long on the driveway, her expression unreadable. Sarah followed her line of sight, a knot forming in her stomach. Max was playing near the edge of the driveway, right next to Lynn's house. "I noticed your little one playing so close to my driveway," Lynn continued, her voice casual, but there was a definite edge to it. "I don't mind kids, but you know how it is? I wouldn't want him to get hurt, especially if someone's not paying attention." There it was, the underlying tension Sarah had anticipated. Lynn's words were sugar-coated, but they were also a criticism, a quiet warning that the boundaries had been crossed. In that moment, the sunny, idyllic morning seemed to shift, as if the world was bracing for something that was about to unfold. Sarah's smile faltered slightly and her body tensed, but she kept her composure. "He's fine. Just playing," she replied, trying to keep the conversation light, hoping Lynn would take the hint and move on. But Lynn wasn't finished. She took another step forward, her voice dropping in volume, though still outwardly calm. "I'm just saying, Sarah, you really should keep an eye on him. The driveway's not a playground, and I'd hate for anything to happen. You know the rules about blocking walkways, right?" It was an innocuous comment, wrapped in the guise of concern, but Sarah could sense the challenge in Lynn's words. It was the same old song. Lynn always had something to say, something to complain about, even when there was nothing wrong. Sarah's patience was wearing thin, but she kept her tone even. "Thanks for the advice, Lynn. I'll keep that in mind." Lynn's gaze lingered for a moment longer, as if she were assessing Sarah, looking for any sign of resistance. Satisfied that Sarah wasn't biting, she offered a tight smile. "Good. Just looking out for the neighborhood." With that, Lynn turned and walked away, the silence falling over the driveway once more. But the tension she had left in the air was thick, suffocating. Sarah watched her retreat, the unease gnawing at her. Max, oblivious to the interaction, picked up his truck and continued playing. But for Sarah, the peace of the morning had been shattered. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing, something she wasn't ready for. In the distance, Lynn's figure disappeared behind her house, but Sarah's mind was racing. Was this really just another petty complaint? Or was there something more beneath the surface? The calm before the storm had passed, and Sarah could feel the storm was coming. The sky, which had been clear and bright just moments ago, now seemed clouded over. The subtle tension that had settled in Sarah's chest began to thicken as the day progressed. The peacefulness of the morning had been replaced by a nagging feeling in the back of her mind, a sense that something was about to happen, something she wasn't prepared for. As Max played, oblivious to the looming conflict, Sarah found herself pacing back and forth in the living room, her thoughts running wild. The doorbell rang, breaking the silence. Sarah stopped in her tracks, a chill running down her spine. She already knew who it was. Her gut instinct had been right. It was Lynn Ford again. Taking a deep breath, Sarah walked toward the door and opened it. There, standing in the doorway with a smug expression, was Lynn, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Sarah forced a smile, trying to appear calm and collected, but there was no mistaking the unease that had taken root inside her. "Yes, Lynn," Sarah asked, keeping her voice neutral. "I need to speak with you," Lynn said, her tone sharp and direct. "It's about your son." Sarah's stomach twisted. The calm and composed version of herself was starting to slip away, replaced by a growing sense of irritation. She had known this moment was coming, but it didn't make it any easier to handle. She motioned for Lynn to come inside, though she already knew this was not going to be a friendly conversation. They both stood in the foyer, the tension thick between them. Sarah could hear the distant sounds of Max's laughter outside, but it felt like it was coming from a different world, one where everything was normal. Here, in this moment, nothing felt normal. "What's going on, Lynn?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "I saw Max playing too close to my driveway again," Lynn began, her voice rising with frustration. "This is the third time today. I told you before that it's not safe. What if someone comes speeding down the street? What if there's an accident? Have you even thought about that?" Sarah clenched her fists at her sides, her patience wearing thin. "Lynn, Max is just playing in the driveway. There's no harm in it. He's not blocking your driveway, and he's not causing any trouble." Lynn's eyes narrowed as she took a step closer. "It's not about him causing trouble. It's about being considerate of the rules. You've had plenty of warnings, and frankly, I'm tired of telling you. If this keeps happening, I'm going to have to report it to the HOA. I've already spoken to a few neighbors, and they're all on my side. You know how important it is to maintain the integrity of this neighborhood." Sarah's jaw tightened. She could feel the heat rising in her chest, but she kept it contained. The HOA had always been a thorn in her side, but she had never allowed it to interfere with her life this way. Still, something about Lynn's words felt like a personal attack, a challenge. It was more than just the neighborhood rules. It was about control, power, and Sarah was tired of it. "You've made your point, Lynn," Sarah said, her voice tinged with frustration. "But Max is not doing anything wrong. He's a child and he's playing. If you don't like it, that's not my problem. Maybe you should try letting him be a kid." Lynn's face reddened, her lips curling into a sneer. "You just don't get it, do you? This isn't about letting him play. It's about safety, and you're not being a responsible parent if you don't take this seriously. Maybe you should think about that before you let him run around causing problems in the neighborhood." The words struck Sarah like a slap in the face. The insult stung, deep in her gut. She fought to keep her composure, but the anger was bubbling beneath the surface. She had spent years carefully building a life for her family, working tirelessly to be a good mother, a good person. And here's Lynn, this stranger, this meddler, telling her she wasn't doing enough, telling her she wasn't a good enough mother. Before Sarah could respond, Lynn took another step forward, her eyes flicking to the driveway, where Max was now running in circles, his laughter still ringing out. "You're so busy defending him, you don't see what's happening right under your nose," Lynn said with a sneer. "One day, something's going to happen, and you'll be the one to blame." The words hit Sarah hard, and for a moment she froze. Her chest tightened with a mix of fear and anger, her protective instincts rising. But then, before she could stop herself, she stepped toward Lynn, her voice low and controlled, but full of fire. "You don't get to talk to me like that. My son is playing, and that's not a crime. You've crossed a line, Lynn, and I won't stand for it." Lynn stood her ground, her lips curling in that same smug expression. "You'll regret this," she muttered under her breath, her tone almost menacing. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence hung in the air like a storm about to break. Max's laughter continued outside, unaware of the escalating tension inside. Sarah could feel the weight of the moment, the shift in the air, the sense that something had been irrevocably broken between her and Lynn. "Get off my property," Sarah said, her voice firm and resolute. "And don't come back unless you want to start a real problem." Lynn's eyes flared with anger, but she said nothing. With a final glare, she turned and walked away, her heels clicking sharply on the wooden floor, each step punctuating the silence. As she stepped out of the door, Sarah stood there, breathless, heart pounding in her chest. The door slammed shut behind her, but Sarah didn't feel the relief she expected. Something inside her shifted. This wasn't over. This confrontation was just the beginning. The next few hours were a blur for Sarah. The adrenaline that had surged through her in the heat of the confrontation with Lynn had left her feeling drained, yet her mind was racing. She tried to focus on Max, who had settled down to watch his favorite cartoon on the couch, but her thoughts kept returning to the exchange with Lynn. The venom in her voice, the way she'd insinuated Sarah was an irresponsible mother, it was a blow that she hadn't expected, not from someone like her. Sarah glanced at the clock. David had said he would be home late, but she'd hoped for more of a distraction by now. She sighed and walked into the kitchen, her fingers running over the countertop, trying to regain some semblance of normalcy. The world outside seemed to carry on as usual, but inside, Sarah felt like everything had shifted. A weight had settled on her chest, and it wasn't going to let up. She went back into the living room, sitting on the edge of the couch beside Max, who was completely oblivious to the storm brewing around them. She smiled softly at him, her heart swelling with love and gratitude for him. At least here, in the quiet of their home, things felt safe, even if everything else seemed to be falling apart. But as she reached for the remote to change the channel, a loud knock echoed through the front door. It startled her, and Max jumped in surprise, looking up at her with wide eyes. "Who could that be?" Sarah murmured, her voice tinged with annoyance. She stood up quickly, wiping her palms on her jeans as she made her way to the door. When she opened it, her breath caught in her throat. Standing before her, with a smug smile plastered across her face, was Lynn. But this time, there was something different about the way she carried herself. Something darker. "I didn't expect to see you again so soon," Sarah said coolly, her voice steady, though she was anything but calm. Lynn pushed past Sarah before she could say another word. stepping into the entryway with a sense of ownership. Sarah frowned, closing the door behind her, feeling her nerves tighten. "You didn't take me seriously, Sarah," Lynn said, her voice colder than it had been earlier. "I told you this wasn't over." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Her chest tightened, the words from their previous confrontation echoing in her mind. "You'll regret this." The same chilling tone. This wasn't just about parking near a driveway anymore, it was something else entirely. Something personal. "What are you talking about, Lynn?" Sarah said, trying to keep her voice even, though she felt a knot in her stomach. "I'm talking about Max," Lynn replied, her eyes cold and calculating. "I don't take kindly to being ignored, especially when it comes to the safety of my neighborhood. You might not care, but I'm going to make sure everyone knows about your lack of concern." Sarah blinked, her heart thudding louder in her chest. "What are you going to do? You don't have the right to accuse me of anything." Lynn's lips curled into a smile that sent a chill down Sarah's spine. "I have every right. The neighbors have already agreed with me, and I've already called the HOA board. This isn't just about me anymore. It's about making sure that people like you don't think they can get away with breaking the rules." A sudden anger surged within Sarah, her protective instincts flaring. "You're crossing a line, Lynn. You can't just go around accusing people of things that aren't true because you don't like them." Lynn leaned in, her face only inches away from Sarah's. "Oh, it's already true. You're not following the rules. And I won't stop until everyone knows exactly who you are." The words hit like a slap. For a moment, Sarah stood frozen, the sting of those words settling deep in her bones. She had tried to avoid conflict, to keep things calm. But now, Lynn was forcing her hand. This wasn't just a complaint anymore, it was an attack. It was personal. Before Sarah could respond, a sharp sound pierced the air. Max's voice suddenly screaming from the living room. "Mom, help!" Without thinking, Sarah's heart skipped a beat, and she rushed toward the sound. Lynn's laughter followed her, a cruel and taunting sound that seemed to echo in her mind. Max was on the ground, his body writhing in pain. Sarah's heart pounded in her ears as she knelt beside him, pulling him into her arms. She could feel his arm at an unnatural angle, the sharpness of his cries like a blade in her chest. "Oh my God!" Sarah gasped, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. "Max! Max, what happened?" I fell, Mommy," Max whimpered, tears streaming down his face. "It hurts so bad." Sarah's mind raced as she gently cradled his arm. It was clear. His arm was broken. She could see it, the way it hung limp, the way he cried out every time she moved him. The panic set in. Her heart seemed to stop, and, for a moment, she couldn't breathe. No, this couldn't be happening. Not now. Not like this. But then, something inside Sarah snapped. She turned her head toward Lynn, who was still standing in the doorway, watching with an unsettling calmness. It was as if nothing mattered to her. Nothing but making Sarah feel small. "You did this." Sarah shouted, her voice trembling with rage. "You pushed him. You've gone too far this time." Lynn's smile faltered for a brief second, but she quickly regained her composure. "I didn't do anything, Sarah. You should have kept him away from the driveway, like I told you." Her words were venom, each one driving a knife deeper into Sarah's heart. She couldn't process the horror of it all, the pain in Max's eyes, the coldness of Lynn's expression. Her child was hurt, and it was Lynn's fault. "Get out," Sarah said, her voice low, full of fury. "Get out of my house. I'm done with you." Lynn didn't say anything further. She turned and walked away, leaving Sarah in the doorway with Max in her arms, his sobs echoing in the empty house. Sarah felt the weight of the world pressing down on her. This wasn't just a broken arm. This was something worse, a mother's fury and a battle she wasn't ready for, but one she now had to face head-on. This was only the beginning, and Sarah was ready to fight. The days that followed felt like an endless storm for Sarah. Every time she closed her eyes, the image of Max's broken arm flooded her mind, along with the memory of Lynn's cold smile. The anger, the fear, the confusion, it all swirled within her, each emotion feeding the other, until she felt like she was losing control. But there was one thing she knew for certain. Lynn had gone too far, and Sarah wasn't going to let this slide. Max's arm had been put in a cast, and while he was recovering, the trauma lingered in the house, thick and heavy. He was still struggling to understand why it had happened. His tiny hands, now slightly clumsy with the cast, would often reach out for his toys or his mother, and every time, a reminder of what had happened shot through Sarah like a bolt of lightning. David had come home as soon as he could, his concern for Max evident, but Sarah hadn't told him everything. The confrontation with Lynn had left her with a sense of dread, and she knew that she had to take action. She had to do something that would make sure Max would never again be caught in the crosshairs of someone like Lynn. By the time David had returned, Sarah had already made her decision. She sat in their bedroom, surrounded by legal papers and files, her laptop open in front of her. As a Supreme Court judge, Sarah knew the law inside and out, and she knew that if she was going to take on someone like Lynn Ford, it wasn't going to be with words alone. She needed a strategy, a plan, and she was going to execute it with precision. David knocked gently before entering, his eyes filled with concern. "Sarah, you look like you're carrying the weight of the world. What's going on?" Sarah took a deep breath, looking up at him. "I'm going to file charges against Lynn." David's eyebrows shot up. "For what? She's just a neighbor causing problems, isn't she?" Sarah shook her head. "It's more than that, David. She hurt Max, and I'm not going to let her get away with it. What she did wasn't just reckless, it was malicious. I'm done being passive. I'm taking her to court." David stepped closer, his expression softening. "I'm with you. But this feels like more than just a legal battle. You're going after her in a way that could change everything." "I'm not just doing it for us," Sarah replied, her voice steady but laced with emotion. "I'm doing it for Max, for every parent who's ever had to deal with someone like her. Lynn has crossed the line. She doesn't get to hurt my child and walk away unscathed. And I'm not going to let her bully me either." David placed a hand on her shoulder. "I get it, Sarah. But what's the next step? How do we make this happen?" Sarah pulled the papers in front of her and pointed to the screen. "I've already started the paperwork. I'll file for a restraining order first, then we'll take this to court. I've already contacted a lawyer to help with the case." She paused, taking in a deep breath as she looked at the files in front of her. Her mind raced through everything, the investigation, the evidence, the witnesses. She had to ensure that this wasn't just a fight against Lynn, but one that would send a message to anyone else who thought they could get away with harassing her family. David nodded slowly, his voice quiet. "And what about the HOA? The neighbors?" "They'll be part of the case," Sarah said firmly. "The HOA gave Lynn the power to act this way, and I won't let them hide behind their rules anymore. They have a responsibility to make sure people like her aren't allowed to terrorize their neighbors." Sarah's words were powerful, each one carrying the weight of years spent studying law, years spent in the courtroom as a judge. But this wasn't just a case about legal principles anymore. This was personal, and Sarah felt the fire in her chest grow hotter with every passing second. Max's soft voice interrupted their conversation from the doorway. "Mom?" Sarah turned around to find him standing there, his cast-covered arm hanging limply at his side, his small face scrunched with worry. The sight of him, his innocent gaze, was a stark contrast to the emotions running wild inside her. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" she asked, walking over to him and kneeling down to his level. I don't want you to be mad anymore," he said, his voice tinged with uncertainty. Sarah's heart broke at the sound of his words. She wrapped him in a hug, her arms tight around him as she whispered, "I'm not mad at you, Max. I'm mad at what happened, and I'm going to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." Max pulled away slightly, his eyes wide. "But are you going to hurt Miss Lynn?" Sarah's breath caught in her throat, her heart heavy with the burden of being both a mother and a judge. She had to protect Max, and she had to show him what justice meant. But she also had to be careful about how she explained things to him. She couldn't let him think that justice meant revenge or violence. "No, sweetheart," Sarah said softly, wiping the tears from his cheek. "I'm going to make sure that no one hurts you again, that's all. Sometimes when people do bad things, We have to show them that it's not okay. But I'll make sure you're safe, I promise. Max nodded, his trust in her unwavering. She could see it in his eyes, that unspoken faith that everything would be okay because she was there, and for that, Sarah would do anything. David watched the exchange, his expression softening as he took a step closer. "We'll get through this together," he said, his voice filled with conviction. Sarah nodded, determination setting in. "We will, and I'll make sure Lynn knows that she can't just bully people. Not on my watch." The weight of what was to come was heavy, but it was also empowering. Sarah was no longer just a mother, she was a judge, and she was going to fight for justice. This was her fight now, and it wasn't just for Max, it was for everything she stood for. The days that followed Sarah's decision to take action were a blur of legal paperwork, phone calls, and meetings with her lawyer, James Foster. She was now fully committed to bringing Lynn to justice, and she wasn't going to stop until she had everything in place. Max's healing process continued, though it was slow, and every time Sarah saw his cast-covered arm, a reminder of what Lynn had done, the anger inside her flared up once more. She couldn't rest until she knew that what had happened to her son would never happen again. Sarah's life, usually filled with the quiet rhythms of family life and her work as a Supreme Court judge, had become a whirlwind of legal tactics. But she felt more focused now than ever before. Every decision she made felt precise, calculated, as though she were preparing for a trial, because, in many ways, that was exactly what she was doing. She couldn't afford to be emotional, she had to be strategic. One afternoon, after a long meeting with James, Sarah returned home and sat down with a pile of documents in front of her. The house was quiet, with only the faint sound of Max playing with his toys in the next room. The normalcy of the sound was almost comforting, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside her. She shuffled through the papers, making notes on each one as she reviewed the evidence. There were witness statements from neighbors who had seen the incident between Max and Lynn, and reports from the local police who had been called to the scene when Max was hurt. But none of it felt like enough. Sarah knew that in order to make her case airtight, she would need more than just words. She needed a smoking gun, something that would make Lynn's actions undeniable. That's when the idea hit her. She needed to investigate Lynn's past. Sarah had access to every legal database, every public record, every piece of information she could need. As a Supreme Court judge, she had the ability to search through legal histories, court cases, and civil disputes. And she wasn't going to waste it. If Lynn had a history of harassment or legal disputes, Sarah was going to find it. She pulled out her phone and quickly dialed James' number. "I need you to look up Lynn Ford. Dig deeper than what's already been reported. I want to know everything, past legal disputes, any history of aggressive behavior, anything that can show a pattern. This isn't just about what happened to Max. This is about showing that Lynn has a history of this." "I'm on it," James replied, his voice calm and professional. "I'll have it for you by tomorrow." Sarah hung up the phone, her mind already racing. If Lynn had a history of similar behavior, it could be the smoking gun she needed to ensure a conviction. She had no intention of letting this woman get away with what she'd done. Not now. Not after everything. The following day, Sarah was in her office when James called back, his voice tinged with the satisfaction of having uncovered something substantial. "You were right," he said, his tone serious. "Lynn Ford has a history. There are 2 previous civil lawsuits involving her and claims of harassment against neighbors. One of them involves a dispute over property lines and a physical altercation with another homeowner. The case was dismissed, but it's a red flag. And there's more. She's also been involved in multiple complaints with the HOA about other neighbors. She's been banned from several community events for, let's just say, her behavior isn't exactly neighborly." Sarah felt her heart race. This was the breakthrough she needed. Lynn had a pattern of harassment. This wasn't just a one-time incident. It was a calculated and consistent effort to control, to intimidate. And now Sarah had the proof. She made a note of everything James had told her, and a sense of resolve began to settle over her. This wasn't just about her son anymore. This was about exposing someone who thought they could get away with bullying their neighbors, someone who believed that her position in the HOA gave her the right to do whatever she wanted without consequences. Max wandered into the office, his face illuminated by the glow of his favorite cartoon playing on the tablet in his hands. He looked up at Sarah, his eyes full of curiosity. "Mom, can I go play outside?" Sarah smiled softly, pushing the weight of the investigation to the back of her mind for a moment. "Of course, Max. Just be careful, okay?" Max nodded enthusiastically and ran off toward the back door. Sarah watched him go, her heart swelling with love for her son. She had to protect him. She had to make sure that no one ever hurt him again, especially not someone like Linford. As Max ran off to play, Sarah sat back in her chair, her mind sharp with focus. She would use everything she had at her disposal. She would take Lynn down, not just for herself, but for every family that had been tormented by this woman's actions. This fight wasn't just about getting justice for Max. It was about standing up to the kind of behavior that had no place in their community. The hours passed quickly as Sarah worked through the details of the case. She reviewed every witness statement, every bit of evidence, and continued to strategize with James. There was still much to do, but with Lynn's history now in the open, Sarah felt a sense of purpose that she hadn't felt in years. This case was bigger than just her family. It was a stand against bullying, against the kind of person who thought they could control others with their power and influence. As the evening drew closer, Sarah stood up from her desk and walked to the window, looking out at the neighborhood. She saw families gathered in their yards, children running and laughing. The image was peaceful, almost idyllic, but Sarah knew better now. She knew that beneath the surface, there were people like Lynn Ford, people who would stop at nothing to get what they wanted, even if it meant hurting others in the process. But Sarah wasn't afraid anymore. She was done being intimidated, done letting her family live in fear. She would fight back, and this time she was going to win. Tomorrow, they would take the next step in the legal battle. Sarah felt a quiet confidence settle over her. The fight wasn't over, but she was ready. The morning sunlight poured through the office window, casting a warm glow over the stack of legal files on Sarah's desk. She sat there, staring at the documents with determination. Max had gone to play with his friends, and David had left for work. Sarah was alone in her thoughts, but she was far from idle. Today was the day she would make the final move against Lynn. It was time to reveal the truth. After receiving the information from James, Sarah had spent hours the night before putting together everything she had discovered about Lynn Ford's past. She wasn't just some disgruntled neighbor. She was a woman with a history of aggressive behavior and a disturbing pattern of bullying her neighbors. But it wasn't enough to just have the facts. Sarah knew that in order to truly bring Lynn to justice, she needed to expose her in a way that would leave no room for doubt. With the help of James, Sarah had obtained court records from Lynn's previous civil suits. They contained shocking details of two separate incidents that had taken place over the years. The first involved a property dispute where Lynn had physically threatened a neighbor when they tried to resolve a simple property line issue. The second was even worse, a long-running campaign of harassment against another homeowner who had dared to voice concerns about her HOA involvement. That neighbor had ultimately been forced to sell their home in order to escape Lynn's relentless intimidation. As Sarah flipped through the papers, the weight of the case settled heavily on her shoulders. Lynn's behavior was no accident. It was deliberate, and it had been happening for years. Sarah had thought that she could handle this on her own, that it was just about what happened to Max. But now, as the pieces of the puzzle came together, it became clear that this wasn't just about one woman's cruelty, it was about a history of abuse that needed to be stopped. The doorbell rang, interrupting Sarah's thoughts. She stood up, her stomach fluttering with anticipation. It was time. She walked quickly to the door, opened it, and found James standing there with a thick folder in his hands. His face was serious, his eyes focused. "You ready?" he asked. Sarah nodded, her expression unwavering. "I've been ready for days." James handed her the folder. "Everything we need is in here. It's time to show Lynn exactly who she's dealing with." The two of them walked to the living room, where Sarah began organizing the documents. There was a sense of urgency now. The moment of truth was fast approaching. She had all the evidence, witness statements, court records, police reports, and she was going to use it all. As she sat at the kitchen table preparing her strategy, Sarah felt a growing sense of justice rising inside her. This wasn't just about vengeance, it was about accountability. Lynn had thought she could hide behind her position, behind her HOA privileges, and intimidate everyone around her. But Sarah was going to make sure that everyone knew the truth. She was going to expose Lynn's dark past to the world. Later that day, Sarah made her way to the neighborhood meeting, a monthly event where residents could voice concerns and bring up issues. Lynn was known to be one of the most vocal members, and Sarah had no doubt that she would be present tonight. But this time, things would be different. This time, it would be Sarah who would have the last word. The meeting room was buzzing with the usual chatter as residents filed in, taking their seats. Sarah walked to the front, her folder in hand, her heart pounding in her chest. She had prepared herself for this moment, but the weight of it still felt enormous. She had never done anything like this before, never stood in front of a room full of people and taken down someone as powerful as Lynn. But she couldn't back down now. As the meeting began, Sarah felt the eyes of the room on her. Lynn was sitting across the room, her usual smug expression plastered on her face. She had no idea what Sarah had planned. Sarah's eyes narrowed as she locked her gaze with Lynn. This was it. The meeting proceeded as usual, with residents voicing their concerns and the board members responding. But Sarah could barely focus. Her thoughts were consumed with the evidence in her hands, with the truth that she was about to reveal. Finally, the moment arrived. Sarah stood up, causing several heads to turn in her direction. "Excuse me," Sarah said, her voice calm but strong. "I'd like to address the board." The room quieted, and everyone turned to face her. Sarah felt the weight of their gaze, but she didn't flinch. She was here for a reason, and she wasn't going to back down. "I'm here today," Sarah continued, "because I believe it's time we all know the truth about Lynn Ford. The truth about her behavior, her actions, and the history she's been hiding behind the guise of an HOA representative." She paused, allowing the words to sink in. She could see Lynn's smug expression faltering, her face turning pale as she realized where this was headed. "For years," Sarah said, "Lynn has harassed her neighbors. She's intimidated families. And when those families tried to stand up for themselves, she resorted to bullying tactics to drive them out. There are court records, 2 civil lawsuits, that prove this. In one case, she physically threatened a neighbor over a property dispute. In another, she bullied a family so badly that they were forced to sell their home just to escape her harassment. But you don't have to take my word for it. I have the records here. I have the evidence." Sarah pulled out the folder and began laying the documents on the table. The room was silent, the only sound the rustling of paper as Sarah flipped through the records. She could feel Lynn's eyes burning into her, but she didn't look up. This was bigger than Lynn. This was about exposing the truth. "I've gathered all the evidence," Sarah said, her voice steady and firm. "And I'm going to make sure that everyone knows exactly who Lynn Ford is and what she's done." Lynn stood up, her face flushed with fury. "This is ridiculous," she shouted. "You can't just—" Sarah raised her hand, silencing her. "You don't get to interrupt me, Lynn. Not anymore." The room erupted in murmurs, the shock and disbelief palpable in the air. Lynn's power was crumbling before her eyes. Sarah knew she was doing the right thing. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for every person who had ever been silenced by someone like Lynn. And this time, the truth was going to win. The aftermath of the neighborhood meeting was intense. The once lively, peaceful community felt tense and divided. People were still talking about what had happened, and Sarah could feel the ripple effect of her actions everywhere she went. The truth about Lynn had been exposed, and Sarah knew the consequences were just beginning. But she also knew that, for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was fighting for something meaningful, something important. Back at home, The door shut with a soft click, and Sarah stood in the hallway, her body drained from the weight of the day's events. The confrontation with Lynn had been everything Sarah had expected and more, but as she dropped her keys onto the table, the reality of what she had done began to settle in. She had gone against someone who had long held power in their neighborhood. She had exposed the woman for who she truly was, and now there was no going back. Max was playing in the living room, his casted arm resting on the couch as he tried to stack his toys. Sarah smiled softly at him, feeling her heart tug in her chest. He was still so young, so innocent, and it hurt her to think about the fear he had experienced during the incident with Lynn. But she had made a promise to him, to herself, and to her family. She would fight for justice. And she had. "Mom." Max called, looking up from his toys with a puzzled expression. "Why did you talk to Miss Lynn like that? Was she being bad?" Sarah sat down beside him, her fingers gently running through his hair as she collected her thoughts. It was always harder to explain things to Max than she had anticipated. His innocent questions always seemed to cut through her, making her realize just how much he truly trusted her. "She wasn't being kind, sweetheart," Sarah began, her voice soft but firm. "What she did to you was wrong. And when someone hurts someone you love, you have to stand up to them. You don't let them get away with it. Not ever." Max looked at her, his eyes wide with confusion, the innocence of childhood still clouding his understanding of the full scope of what had happened. "But why didn't you just ask her to stop? Why did you have to tell everyone?" Sarah took a deep breath, trying to gather her words. Sometimes asking someone to stop isn't enough. When people hurt others, it's important to make sure everyone knows the truth. That way, they can't keep hurting people. And sometimes the only way to make sure something is right is to show everyone what's really happening. Max didn't fully understand, but he nodded, his small hand reaching for her. "I just want to play now, Mom." Sarah smiled and hugged him tightly, feeling the weight of his words settle in her chest. "I just want to play now." The simplicity of the request stung, reminding Sarah that despite everything, Max still wanted the safety and freedom that every child deserved. He shouldn't have had to face something like this. No child should. Later that evening after dinner, Sarah and David sat down in their living room. The tension from the meeting still hung in the air, but there was also something else, something Sarah couldn't quite name. They had been through a lot in the past few days, but this was more than just a legal battle. This was about their family, their home, their values. Sarah had never felt so certain of what she was doing, but she also knew it had cost her something. David looked over at her, his expression serious but supportive. "How are you feeling about everything?" Sarah hesitated before answering, her eyes focused on the family photo on the mantel. "I feel like I've done the right thing, but I also feel like things are about to change, and I'm not sure if we're ready for that." David stood up and walked over to her, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "You're stronger than you think, Sarah. You've always been, and we're in this together. I know we'll get through whatever comes next, but you need to remember, no matter how difficult this gets, you're doing it for all of us." Sarah leaned into him, the comforting warmth of his embrace grounding her in the moment. The world outside might be changing, but in this room, with her family, she felt safe. It was a reminder that no matter what happened, she had the strength and support to keep moving forward. "We'll get through it," she whispered, the conviction in her voice stronger than it had ever been before. "Because we're a family, and no one can break us." The next morning, Sarah found herself sitting in front of her computer, typing up the final draft of the legal paperwork she would file later that day. The battle with Lynn wasn't over yet, but the fight had shifted. This was no longer about a single incident. This was about standing up to a person who had been allowed to get away with abuse for far too long. Sarah was prepared for the long road ahead, but she was ready to take on whatever came next. Her phone buzzed on the desk, and she picked it up to see a message from James. "We've got the date for the hearing. It's scheduled for next week. We're going to get this in front of a judge. Let's make sure Lynn never does this to anyone again." Sarah stared at the message for a moment, her heart beating faster. The fight was far from over, but the first step had been taken. She had exposed Lynn for who she truly was, and now she had the chance to make sure that her actions would no longer hurt anyone else. With a deep breath, Sarah hit send on the email to James, confirming the next step. There was no turning back now. She was ready, and this time she would make sure justice prevailed for Max, for herself, and for every family that had ever been terrorized by someone like Lynn. The fight was just beginning, but Sarah was ready to see it through to the end. The morning of the trial dawned with a quiet intensity. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a pale light over the city as Sarah prepared herself for the battle ahead. The legal team had arrived early at the courthouse, and Sarah felt the weight of the moment settle in her chest. Today was the day everything would be put on the line. This wasn't just about legal jargon or court procedures. This was about making sure that no one, not even someone like Lynn Ford, could get away with the kind of behavior she had displayed. Max was staying with his aunt, and David had taken the day off work. His presence had always been a calming force for Sarah, and now, more than ever, she needed that sense of stability. She moved through the house quickly, the quiet hum of the morning surrounding her as she dressed in her professional suit. Her hands shook slightly, but she steadied herself with a deep breath. She had done the hard work, built the case from the ground up. Now it was time to see it through. As Sarah drove to the courthouse, her mind replayed the events that had led to this point. The meeting with the HOA, the confrontation with Lynn, the investigation into Lynn's past, all of it had led to this moment. She had gathered every piece of evidence she could find. She had exposed Lynn's history, her behavior, her disregard for the well-being of her neighbors. Today, she would ensure that justice was done. The courthouse loomed ahead, a stately building with columns that seemed to stand as a reminder of the weight of justice. As Sarah entered, she felt the familiar sense of responsibility that came with the building's walls. She wasn't just here as a mother today, she was here as a judge, prepared to deliver her case in front of others who had the same responsibility. Inside, she was greeted by James, her attorney, who gave her a reassuring nod. They'd been preparing for this day for weeks, but no matter how much they had rehearsed, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this was her moment to prove something, not just to Lynn, but to herself. As they entered the courtroom, Sarah's eyes swept over the room. The judge was already seated at the bench, his gavel in hand, his eyes focused on the proceedings. She could feel the pressure mounting as the opposing counsel, representing Lynn, glanced over at her. The tension in the room was palpable, but Sarah held her ground. Lynn sat on the other side of the courtroom, her posture rigid, her face a mask of defiance. She had come prepared to fight, and Sarah could see the smirk on her face. But there was something different in Lynn's eyes now, something that spoke of fear that she would no longer be able to control the narrative. As the trial began, the formalities quickly fell away, and Sarah dove into the heart of the case. She had prepared a detailed timeline of events, showing not only the harm Lynn had caused, but the pattern of behavior that had led to this. She presented witness statements, police reports, and the court records from Lynn's previous civil disputes. One by one, the evidence was laid bare. Each document, each piece of testimony, was another nail in Lynn's coffin. Sarah's voice never wavered as she presented the facts. She kept her tone measured, her words calculated. This was about justice, not emotion, and she knew she had to remain calm if she was going to win this. But as she spoke, the memories of Max's pain, his cries for help, flooded her mind. She had to fight not just for him, but for every family who had been forced to live in fear of Lynn. The opposing counsel tried to poke holes in Sarah's case, questioning the validity of the evidence and attempting to discredit the witnesses. They tried to paint Lynn as a misunderstood figure, someone who had only acted out of concern for the community's well-being. But Sarah knew better. She knew that Lynn's actions had nothing to do with concern. They had everything to do with control, with power, with intimidation. The tension in the courtroom heightened as Sarah's lawyer, James, presented his closing argument. He was a seasoned attorney, but even he knew how important this case was. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he began, his voice steady and clear. What we've heard here today is not just a series of unfortunate events. What we've seen is a pattern, a deliberate, calculated attempt to harm and intimidate a family simply trying to live their lives. Lynn Ford has used her position and influence in this neighborhood to bully and harass her neighbors, and today, we ask you to hold her accountable for her actions. James's words echoed in Sarah's mind as the jury listened intently. She knew the weight of his statement. This was more than just a legal case, it was a statement to everyone in the room about the power of truth and the importance of standing up for what was right. When it was finally Sarah's turn to speak, she stood tall, her eyes scanning the room. I stand here today not just as a mother seeking justice for her child, but as a judge who believes in the integrity of the law, she said. We cannot allow people like Lynn Ford to use their power to harm others. We cannot allow people who seek control through intimidation to go unchallenged. My son has suffered, but he is not alone. The truth is here today, and I ask you, the jury, to see it for what it is. Her words hung in the air for a moment, and Sarah felt the weight of the silence settle around her. The room was still, every person in it waiting for the decision that would shape the future of the case. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, but she knew she had done everything she could. As the jury deliberated, Sarah sat back down in her seat, her eyes never leaving Lynn's face. The smug expression was gone now, replaced by a look of uncertainty. The power had shifted, and Sarah knew that no matter what happened next, she had already won. Justice, in this moment, was not just about the verdict, it was about the truth being seen for what it was. And Sarah had made sure that. The minutes seemed to stretch on endlessly as Sarah sat in the courtroom, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. The jury had been deliberating for what felt like hours. Outside, the sun had dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the city as the weight of the trial pressed down on Sarah's shoulders. She had prepared for this moment, but nothing could prepare her for the stillness in the air. It was as though the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for the final word. Across the room, Lynn sat rigidly in her seat, her expression one of quiet defiance. But Sarah could see the faint flicker of doubt behind her eyes. She had been exposed, her past laid bare for everyone to see, and Sarah knew that Lynn must have been feeling the heat of the moment. The control that Lynn had once wielded so easily over the neighborhood was slipping away, and Sarah had taken it from her piece by piece. Now, it was just a matter of waiting for the inevitable. The bailiff approached the judge's bench, and Sarah's breath hitched as the silence deepened. The judge, a stern man with years of experience, raised his hand, signaling for everyone to be seated. The jury had returned with their decision. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as the judge spoke. "We have reached a verdict," he announced, his voice echoing through the courtroom. "Will the jury foreperson please stand?" The room grew still as the foreperson, a middle-aged man with a tired look in his eyes, stood up. He cleared his throat before speaking. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Lynn Ford, guilty of harassment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and negligence that led to the injury of the plaintiff's child." The words landed like a heavy blow. Sarah felt her chest tighten, her vision momentarily blurring. A sense of relief washed over her, and she struggled to keep her composure. She had fought for this moment, for Max, for herself, and for every person who had been hurt by someone like Lynn. But now, as the verdict was read aloud, the enormity of it hit her all at once. Lynn's face drained of color. Her mouth opened in a silent protest, but no words came out. The smugness that had once defined her had been shattered, leaving her vulnerable, exposed. Sarah could see the panic in her eyes, the realization that the power she had once held over the neighborhood was gone. She had underestimated Sarah, and now she was paying the price. As the foreperson continued reading, the details of Lynn's behavior were laid bare, one by one. The physical threats, the repeated harassment, and the intentional infliction of emotional harm. It was all there in black and white, and now Lynn had to answer for it. The room seemed to close in around Sarah as she absorbed the full weight of the verdict. She had won, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like justice. The judge nodded gravely, his eyes never leaving the defendant. The court will impose sentencing at a later date. For now, the defendant is to remain in custody until further notice. Sarah exhaled sharply, her shoulders sagging with the relief that she had been holding in for so long. She had made it. She had fought and she had won. Outside the courthouse, the cool evening air felt like a balm against the tension that had built up over the past few weeks. Sarah walked briskly, her steps quick but steady as she made her way toward the car. David was waiting for her at the curb, a small smile on his face as he opened the door for her. He had been by her side through every step of the process, supporting her when the weight of the case felt too heavy to bear. She knew how much it had cost him, too, and she was grateful for his unwavering presence. "How do you feel?" he asked as they drove away from the courthouse, the city lights casting long shadows along the streets. "I feel like it's finally over," Sarah replied softly, her gaze fixed on the passing scenery. "I did what I had to do. For Max. For us. For everyone who had to suffer at her hands." David reached over and squeezed her hand, his thumb brushing over her fingers in a gesture of support. "You did more than that. You showed everyone that no one, no matter how powerful they think they are, can just push people around and get away with it." Sarah turned to look at him, her heart full. "I couldn't have done it without you, David. You've been my rock through all of this." He smiled, his eyes softening as he looked at her. "We're in this together, Sarah. Always." Later that night, as Sarah tucked Max into bed, the weight of the day's events finally settled into the quiet of their home. She leaned over and kissed him gently on the forehead, brushing a strand of hair from his face. Max stirred slightly, his small body shifting under the blankets. "Good night, Max," Sarah whispered, her voice full of love and relief. "I'm so proud of you." Max's sleepy eyes fluttered open, and he smiled up at her. "I'm glad you made things right, Mommy." Sarah's heart swelled with emotion as she sat beside him, watching him drift off to sleep. He was safe. They were safe. And no one could hurt him like that again. As she walked back to the living room, she felt a quiet peace settle over her. The fight had been long and difficult, but it had been worth it. She had done what she promised she would do. She had fought for justice, and she had won. And in that moment, Sarah knew that the hardest part was behind her. The storm had passed. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey of justice and triumph. If you've been following Sarah's story and want to see more powerful, real-life stories of strength and resilience, be sure to hit that subscribe button and stay tuned for future episodes. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let us know how you feel about what Sarah went through, because we want to hear your voice. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss a moment of the action. Stay strong, stay united, and remember, HOA denied access.